Now, as a biology professor in the UK, I take it for granted that I'll be teaching evolution. Students arrive having covered the basics of natural selection and evolutionary change at school. The lack of a designer in the process, the non-directed nature of evolution, and its fundamental relationship to how we understand life are all generally established by the time we get to tackle the nuts and bolts. But in many places, evolution and its relationship with religion remains controversial. This week, we're exploring that relationship. Now, with more than 4,000 recognised religions, we can't cover them all, but we can certainly make a start. We sent Science and Action's Roland Pease to Boston to talk with PhD student Liz Barnes and Professor Sara Brownell from Arizona State University. They've been looking at how evolution is taught to people with Christian beliefs.
Even in first-year majors biology courses, study has shown that 50% of the students are rejecting evolution. Right. So what we're really interested in is this disconnect between students that come into our biology classes with religious beliefs. Often, in the context we're looking at Arizona State, those are usually Christian beliefs. And then the folks teaching them tend to not have religious beliefs. So biologists, evolutionary biologists in particular, they don't tend to have religious beliefs. So we have this cultural divide between students that have religious cultures and biology faculty teaching biology at the college level that basically have secular beliefs.
The interesting thing is that they have chosen biology, so then it doesn't sound like they're rejecting science as a whole.
Correct. So we have an interview study that actually speaks to this specifically. So we interviewed the experiences of religious students, specifically Christian and Jewish students in biology classes, and asked them those very questions. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so first, oftentimes our biology majors, the vast majority of them are coming in as pre-med. So they want to be doctors, which has a little bit different of an identity profile than somebody's coming in wanting to be a research biologist, right? And in our interviews, what we found are these religious students, the ones that are going into pre-med, will say things like, well, I'm going to be a doctor, and actually I don't need to accept evolution or know anything about evolution to be an effective physician, right?
So what ends up happening is they take evolution, because often evolution is a required course, but then they say things like, I'm just learning it for the grade, and I try to learn it and I try to forget it as quickly as possible, right? Because we've set up this dichotomy where it's either you can accept evolution and not be religious, or you can be religious and reject evolution, right? And so what we're trying to do is bridge that gap.
So Liz, you've been doing a lot of the groundwork, as I understand, on this research. So the point is there is a different way of instructing in evolution so that those who are resistant are more likely to come along with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So our students, what we find in our studies is that a lot of our students come in with this misconception that there's only one of two views. Like Sara said, you're either accepting evolution and you are an atheist, or you're religious and you reject evolution. But the fact of the matter is we have a wide range of positions in the middle of these two extremes, right? And we even have a lot of biologists and religious leaders who occupy this position of accepting evolution, but still believing in God, and that this is a position where students can reconcile that religious belief with evolution. And if we actually communicate that to our students, rather than the current practice, which is to just not say anything at all about it, then we can help students to reconcile those two things. Because if we don't say anything, students often just think that they're one or the other.
So this is about science. Have you got evidence that changing the approach changes the response?
So what we've seen is in our studies that we reduce the number of students who perceive a conflict with religion and evolution by 50% using our instruction, right? And when we look at the literature, we see that just plain instruction on evolution doesn't usually change students' views on religion and evolution. So we don't have a control group in our study, but comparing it to the past literature, we're seeing quite a large effect of our instruction.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by changing the way you instruct it. If it just comes down to giving a list of famous scientists like, say, Francis Collins of the NIH, well, he believes in God, so that's fine. I mean, does it just come down to that?
So, I mean, it's pretty simplistic at some level, right? And I think that as the instructor has to buy into it. They can't be like, there are these people that believe in God and also believe in evolution, but I don't agree with them, right? And so that kind of rhetoric is not going to be helpful. But yeah, it seems like it's very subtle, small things that seem to make a big difference. So in the study that we did where we interviewed religious students, a lot of them talked about a conversation that an instructor had at the very beginning of starting an evolution module in her class, about how there's different viewpoints and about how there are religious scientist role models. And again, it could be a conversation that could potentially be as short as 10 minutes, and it seems to have a positive impact on students.
Right.
I mean, I think a lot of people listening to this will be saying, hang on, are you compromising on the science? Are you sort of engaging with creationism or intelligent design?
No, we're not.
It's not to give credibility to creationism. We know based on science that's incorrect, right? So it's not giving an alternative set of viewpoints in the classroom. We're actually trying to say that instead there is no two sides. There's actually this middle ground.
How do your instructors engage with this, though, Liz? I mean, I just imagine huge numbers of biologists I know who would feel really uncomfortable going into Evolution 101 and saying, oh, by the way, before I start, anyone in here who goes to church, don't be frightened. I mean, it's just not their way of thinking.
Absolutely, and that's actually the exact point that we're trying to make, is that these instructors come in with this set of cultural beliefs and cultural norms that is being infused into their teaching, but really what they should be thinking about are their students and what kind of cultures and religious backgrounds these students come from and what they need in order to be successful in learning biology.
There's a lot of aspects of teaching that are uncomfortable, right? And I think that instructors figure out ways to get over that, right? And I think that this is one area that a lot of instructors have just kind of said, okay, I don't have to deal with that. And I think part of it is because, our data suggests this, that part of it is because they haven't had their own worldview conflict between religion and evolution, so they don't understand what those students are dealing with. We actually have another study that hasn't actually been published yet. We interviewed instructors at Christian universities and asked them how they teach evolution to their Christian students, and they teach in remarkably different ways than the instructors at secular institutions. They acknowledge different viewpoints, they have more discussion, they present often themselves as religious scientist role models.
And what's really interesting about that study is what we're finding is when we ask them why they do that, they cite their own religious cultural backgrounds and beliefs as a motivator because they know what it's like to have to go through this perceived conflict, right? And they want to make it easier for their students than it was for them.
This approach of finding a middle ground is an interesting one, but does it translate to other religions? Well, it turns out that's a question we can answer, at least for Islam. Salman Hamid is Associate Professor at Hampshire College, Massachusetts, and Visiting Fellow at Dartmouth College. He's been researching the reception of evolution in Muslim communities. I asked him how Islam and evolution get along, but first, as ever, I learnt that things are a bit more complex than that.
There are about over 1 billion Muslims in the world. And they're not a monolithic entity, and that reflects in the way Muslims perceive evolution.
So if we were to go to a predominantly Muslim country and look at, say, a school textbook, what sort of story would we see in there? Would we see the classic scientific, accepted, almost dogmatic kind of viewpoint on evolution, or would we see something different being developed?
So if we just talk about the way it is included in textbooks, perhaps that is one way of thinking about the diversity. In Pakistan, it is included in textbooks, but with a Quranic verse as a starting point. And so in some ways it gives the cover of religion, as to say, but then it says that evolution doesn't clash with a religion. And then it goes on and presents evolution as a fact of science.
So once you've been able to square off, if you like, the Quranic interpretation of how these things work, once that's out of the way, it's kind of like evolution's fine, let's go for it.
That's exactly right. And there is another province where the textbook in Pakistan, they actually spend a couple of pages on looking at the Quranic interpretation of evolution. They settle it towards the end. They explicitly say, now that we have seen that evolution and Quran are compatible, now let's talk about the scientific view of evolution.
Remarkably similar then to what we heard from the United States with Christian students, finding that middle ground between religious beliefs and scientific evidence. But as we heard from the start, the Muslim world is diverse, and that diversity is reflected in the ways that this accommodation can or can't be made.
In Malaysia, in the same way, it is included in biology textbooks, but religion is not mentioned in the context. In Iran, it is also included in textbooks. It has wonderful examples of transitional fossils, including Archaeopteryx, and religion is not really mentioned. But then there are other cases. One extreme case, for example, is Saudi Arabia, where textbooks go out and explicitly reject evolution. And they present Darwin as a Western figure who rejected God and other things that we know are not necessarily true, but certainly they go out and take extra steps to reject evolution.
And it's interesting that you say that. So they're rejecting evolution not necessarily from a Quranic scholarship sort of way of looking at it, but more from the fact that it's seen as a Western thought.
Right, and that, I think, it's a key component of how evolution gets framed in discussions. In Turkey, it has been a political topic between the secularists and the Islamists. So, for example, in Turkey, evolution has been coming in and out of textbooks for the last 30 years, depending upon the government that is there and depending upon who is writing the textbooks.
So in many places, it's not as simple as religion and science. Politics also plays a crucial role. To discuss this further, Science and Action's Roland Pease is back from Boston. Roland, is this something we've come across in other religions?
Well, I mean, it certainly is the case with Christianity. What I found so interesting was the message that Salman was delivering was very similar to this one. The pressure for things like creationism or so-called intelligent design, which is trying to find some halfway house.
Creationism 2.0.
That's right. It's very linked up to politics. It is about identity, I think. And that was what I found so interesting about Sara and Liz when I was talking to them, was that they're saying you just embrace people and it makes a difference to what they learn. And, you know, my background is in physics and chemistry. And if there is a God and God chooses a certain kind of chemistry and a certain kind of physics for the clockwork of the universe, doesn't make much difference. But if you go to the softer sciences like biology, I mean, you're a biologist, you teach biology, so that's, you know, that is, how different do you think that is?
Yes, I teach evolution, and evolution in all its guises and forms, and yeah, the notion of standing up in front of a bunch, a classroom and sort of having a series of caveats and a series of sort of statements about people's beliefs and things is completely alien. But I guess I'm teaching in a country where those sorts of pressures don't really exist. What is interesting, though, is that when those pressures do exist, as we've heard, there's this sort of dualism. There's this ability to be able to have these two seemingly conflicting narratives running at the same time. I mean, I think that's really, really interesting.
Absolutely. And there are scientists like Francis Collins, discovered the cystic fibrosis gene, led the Human Genome Project, but is a very devout Christian. And it always seems to me that he's able somehow to have these two magisteria, which is a concept I don't really like, sitting side by side, and he sort of parks one of them in favour of the other at some point or other. I've never managed to talk to him about it.
Yes, it's interesting. Is it the same as the sort of dualisms that we see in people's lives all the time? Most people, for example, know that smoking is extremely harmful to them, and yet many people continue to smoke. Is it similar to that sort of dualism, do you think? Or?
Well, I suppose you know that smoking's bad for you, so there you're just going against your own conscience. But in another way, there's this dualism. People find quantum mechanics, and that's the subject that I'm familiar with, hard, but it makes them want to learn it. And I suppose that's the interesting question, isn't it, with evolution? The people who say it's hard may not actually want to engage with it. Rather, don't look for the problems rather than thinking, this is fantastic and I want to look deeper.
I suppose it's partly down to the fact that quantum mechanics doesn't offend people, whereas you get the impression that the concept of evolution is deeply offensive, actually, to some people who hold certain religious beliefs.
Pity Einstein's not here. I think he was offended.
This dualism, this ability to be able to hold two seemingly conflicting things in your head at the same time and make both of them right at some point or another, is something I find really fascinating, and it's something that I explored a bit further with Salman Hamid.
In some ways, you might think that these two things are completely separate, but what they are doing are applying two different epistemologies to the same question. So they are looking at evolution and have two different ways of evaluating it, and it exists in their mind. I don't think it is cognitive dissonance. I think they have just figured out a way of how to keep their two worlds separated by space. One of my favorite examples regarding that is a student in a Pakistani university, at an elite Pakistani university, said, well, I accept evolution when I'm in the hospital, but I reject it when I go home.
And I think that poses more of a problem, actually, to people who are very entrenched, if you like, in the evolutionary thought, which I guess I would count myself in. That seems to be a problem because I think we find it difficult to reconcile how you could have that dualism going on. But actually, for the people that do, it doesn't seem to be a problem. It almost feels as if this religion-evolution divide is wholly artificial, actually.
I think it's a really important point.
And do you think for most people, I guess within the scientific world, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, we've got very into this sort of almost conflict between religion and science, and it's been built up and lots of people have sold a lot of books over it and made careers over it. But do you think for most people outside of that sphere, it's actually not that important to people?
I think we are making more of evolution than it in reality it probably is. Once evolution becomes a political or identity marker, then it's a different story.
We've got used to viewing the religion-science divide through the lens of evolution. But as we've heard, not only is the religious world complex, it's also more accommodating than many might think. People are able to juggle their personal faith with an understanding of and even an acceptance of the science of evolution. In fact, for many people, the seemingly difficult conflict of science and religion and the thorny issue of evolution really isn't that difficult at all. Now, I freely admit I'm an atheist, and like many, I have a problem reconciling religious beliefs with my view of the world. But most of us simultaneously hold conflicting views on all sorts of topics, and we're still able to find a way through. I can't suddenly decide to believe in something, but maybe I can believe in a little less ranting at dinner parties in future. Well, that's it for Science in Action, which was produced by Louisa Field. More from us at bbcworldservice.com. But until next week, goodbye. That's it from the Science in Action podcast, which was produced by Louisa Field. By the way, if you have a science question you're desperate to know the answer to, then why not email the BBC World Service Crowdscience team on crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. And be sure to check out their podcast. The latest one answers the question, should we eat insects?